So inside of an atom, there are three main particles that we deal with: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons are in the nucleus of the atom. Electrons are zipping around on the outside. Protons have a positive charge. Electrons have a negative charge. And neutrons are neutral. Your protons and neutrons are the ones that have a weight. So we weigh them in atomic mass units, or AMUs. Your electrons weigh, 2,000 times smaller than that, so we don't even worry about weighing them. They're more useful for determining if they have a charge or not. Do not forget, proton is the name tag. You change the number of protons, you change the element you're talking about. Right? Carbon has 6 protons. That does not change. If it does, we're not talking about carbon anymore. And so proton is the name tag. It's what gives that element its particular property. And so it's positively charged, located in the center or nucleus of the atom. It's the identifying number of the atom. We made up a weight for them. We call it an atomic mass unit, or AMU. And it makes up part of the atom's mass number. And so if you go back to this and you look at one of these, the number at the top is the atomic number. That's the number of protons. That does not change. It's the name tag. You change protons, you change the element that we're talking about. This number down here can fluctuate a little bit. Part of it is protons. It's the mass number though. So if you think mass, which two have a mass, have a weight? Protons and neutrons. And so the mass number is just the combination of those two. How many are inside the nucleus? So because that proton amount does not change, we know that is permanent when we're talking about that element. We can use the mass number, subtract the protons, and figure out how many neutrons we have. Because it's the other particle that has a weight. They have no charge, they're neutral. They just increase or decrease the weight of the atom. There's an average number usually at the bottom, because not all elements are come in the same form, or not all atoms come in the same form. There can be isotopes. But they also weigh 1 AMU and combine with protons to make the atom's mass number. Electrons are negatively charged. Remember, they're zipping around outside the atom in particular shells, depending on their amount and depending on their charge, depending on how much energy they have. They're 2,000 times smaller than a proton, so we don't even worry about weighing them. It's a minuscule amount, it doesn't matter. It's not what's important about electrons for our purposes. Electrons, however, are the reason that atoms can bond to other things. So they're extremely important biochemically to make sure that atoms can bond, or we can break things apart, or we can store things and move things around. So electrons, you could think, are responsible for reactions, essentially. The electrons are sort of like the energy that we're trying to pass around. You don't have to learn the shells in here, but don't forget that electrons exist in those shells, those clouds around the outside of the atom. At any particular time, we can know where they might be. We can't pinpoint exactly where they are, but we can get a good idea of where they might be. Chemical bonds unite into groupings. They can make crystalline structures, sheets, all kinds of stuff. There are ionic bonds and covalent bonds. Remember, ionic are your weak bonds, your salts, your metal and non-metal, things that don't really, that electron can easily be broken apart. So if you think a way to memorize this, if you remember back to the stories in your chemistry or biology class, sodium chloride, table salt, it dissolves pretty quickly in water, right? Most of us know that. So if you can remember that an ionic bond is a salt, metal, non-metal, and table salt dissolves easily, Maybe that will help you remember that ionic bonds are relatively, weak, easily dissolvable bonds. As opposed to covalent bonds, you think like cooperation, a nice strong handshake, those bonds are not easily broken, which we want because most of our body is made up of covalent bonds. We do not want our body to break down. And so ionic, metal, non-metal, easily broken down, relatively weak, covalent, strong bonds. The important part about ionic bonds is when they break down, they form those ions because they're sharing electrons. So let's just go back to the sodium chloride story. That's sodium and chloride, NaCl. When they break down, that's now a positive sodium and a negative chlorine. And so those are ions now, free to be absorbed by something else, or if the water evaporates, free to bond together. And a lot of our feedback loops rely on creating those ions to change that concentration gradient. Because water tends to follow ions, water tends to follow differences, and so we will release hydrogen, or we'll break down our bone and release calcium, or we'll release sodium to make sure that we maintain that homeostasis. Ions become important, especially when we get to the muscle chapter, because we do a lot of muscle physiology in here. And so we'll need to know about calcium being released and absorbed. And so just remember, an ion is a charged atom. It has a plus sign or a minus sign beside it, or +2, +3, depending on what we're talking about. But ion is a charged atom. Is that old news for most people, right? You remember the plus sign, right? Na plus, Cl minus. It's a charged atom. There's an imbalance in the number of protons and electrons in it. And so that's what gives it its plus or minus. The cool thing about table salt is when you get NaCl, as it forms a crystalline structure, it forms a cube. Smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way down to the smallest ones. It just forms cubes over and over and over and over again. Covalent bonds are strong and stable bonds between atoms of similar nature. So nonpolar covalent is an equal sharing of electrons. Polar is unequal sharing. So if we had this image, here's a nonpolar bond. Those electrons are shared equally. Polar bond, the electron is spending more time on one side of the atom than the other. So we now have a difference in charge. And so it's more positive or more negative on one side. So they draw that little lowercase Greek symbol there to mean Greek, I think it's lowercase delta, to mean positive or negative. It's not a true positive or negative, but the electron are just more on that. Do we remember why? What does the word electronegativity mean? Do you remember? Electronegativity. So picture the periodic table in your mind. If we go from the left to right, bottom to top, we are increasing in electronegativity. And so ignore the noble gases, but all the way up to the top right, so chlorine, oxygen, all of those atoms are highly electronegative. That means they have more of a pull on that electron. So the electron is spending more time near that, if we can picture it flying around in that cloud. As opposed to hydrogen, if you can picture in your mind the periodic table, hydrogen's all the way on the top left. And so slightly electronegative, barely. And so if we have a combination of chlorine, highly electronegative, with hydrogen, barely electronegative, the electrons are going to spend more of their time right here. And so it's kind of like taking a balloon and rubbing it against your hair. You're moving all those electrons to that side of the balloon. And now you can stick it to the wall or whatever, and it sticks there for a little bit until the electrons balance out and it falls down. But that's all that means. Covalent bonds are strong bonds between, mostly between non-metals, so the atoms on your top right of the periodic table, and hydrogen. Carbon dioxide is a covalently bonded. Glucose is covalently bonded. And so very strong bonds. Because some of those atoms are polar, so because the electron is spending more time on one side of the atom to the other, some electronegative molecules can stick to each other and form what we call hydrogen bonds. We're not actually sharing that electron, but it's a static attraction. They occur between hydrogen and oxygen, nitrogen, and fluorine, and another. Do I have a picture? Yeah. So I'm going to skip to my picture here. And so if we could picture our water molecule. Here's oxygen, very electronegative. Here's hydrogen, not very electronegative. So we now have a polar bond, more negative on this side, more positive on this side. Well, opposites attract. And so if you have a bunch of those molecules together, the positive side of this molecule is going to be attracted to the negative side of this molecule is going to be attracted to the positive side of this one and form this little static attraction. This is a hydrogen bond, and it is the reason that life can exist. Without these hydrogen bonds, we would not be able to exist like we exist. We rely fully on these hydrogen bonds for water. We rely on it for the energy at the basic level of our cells. And so we require these bonds. And so we say they're weak because if we think about them from our human perspective, we can break them pretty easily. When we style our hair in the mornings, or if you use water to wet your hair in the mornings, you're breaking hydrogen bonds. And then once they dry, those bonds are reforming, sometimes in a new shape. At the internal cell level, they're pretty strong. They do require a lot of energy to break. Water requires a lot of energy to break those hydrogen bonds. And so they're just static attractions, however. They're not a true exchange of those electrons, but they're extremely important for life on the planet.